Good afternoon, and welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists October webinar, where we'll be learning about toxic pollution in wetlands and remediation actions. We're very pleased that you have all made time to enjoy this wonderful program. Okay, let me advance this slide here. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, Lewis, you're good to go.
Okay. Having a little bit of technical difficulty advancing the slide here. There I am. Okay. My name is Louis Mantini. I'm a member of the Society's webinar committee, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. The general format for today's webinar will be a 45-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by approximately 15 minutes for questions. Anytime during the presentation, you can type your questions into the questions pane of your control panel, and I will pose the questions to our presenter at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording following the webinar. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that you'll also receive, and that will help us plan future events. If you'd like a copy of today's slides, please find a PDF copy in the handout section of your control panel. And finally, if you're familiar with the SWS Twitter Symposium, you can tweet about today's webinar at #SWSwebinar. Tony, could you advance a slide, please? Thank you. We're also proud to announce this webinar has been pre-approved by the SWS Professional Certification Program and is applicable for continuing education credits that can be applied to your professional wetland scientist certification or renewal. Participation certificates are available through an automated process initiated by an email from Michelle Sozek, our SWS business manager. This should occur in approximately 24 hours following the webinar, and please be certain to check your spam folder if you don't see Michelle's email correspondence. Participation certificates are also available for those who watch webinar recordings, which can be found on the past webinars page of the SWS website. So, with the logistics out of the way, we'll continue with today's webinar, where our presenter is Dr. Ahmad Mahdavi from Tehran, Iran. Dr. Mahdavi is an environmental toxicologist. He earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Tehran, followed by his PhD in 1990 from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. As a pioneer of ecotoxicology, Dr. Mahdavi initiated an international research effort into the impacts of pesticides, initially in a joint symposium between Guelph and Mississippi State in the United States, and later at University of California, Berkeley in 2000. Allow me at this moment to note that the word pesticide is inclusive to include herbicides, fungicides, among many other control chemicals. Dr. Mahdavi established the NGO Sustainable Agriculture and Environment in 2002 for pesticide and chemical pollution reduction and regulations in Iran, and later in Ontario prior to going global. Dr. Mahdavi has presented for and supported the United Nations Environmental Program Convention on Migratory Species for preventing poisoning in wildlife, particularly regarding impacts upon wetlands and migratory birds. He's a member of several national and international societies, and to name a few, there are the Mountain Partnership, which is an official United Nations partnership dedicated to improving the lives of mountain peoples and protecting mountain environments around the world. He's also a member of the Iranian Society of Toxicology, the Entomological Society of America, the International Society for the Study of Xenobiotics, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, and the Sustainable Consumption and Production Clearinghouse. Dr. Mahdavi also introduced the neem tree from the Persian Gulf to the world. And for those who do not know, like me, the neem tree's bark, leaves, and seeds are used to make medicine. Less frequently, the root, flower, and fruit are also used. And the bark is used for malaria, stomach and intestinal ulcers, skin diseases, pain, and fever. The flower is used for reducing bile, controlling phlegm, and treating intestinal worms. So Dr. Mahdavi continues to focus upon United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, ecosystem-based adaptations, and global activities to conserve migratory birds. He works in cooperation with Eye on Earth, Digital Earth, Open Data, computational toxicology, and many other recent international efforts to conserve biodiversity. He actively uses geospatial tools such as ICT and IoT for the benefit of biodiversity and the agricultural environment. It's my privilege today to introduce you all to Dr. Mahdavi. Thank you.
Hello. Do you want me to start the webinar now? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. The webinar is about the toxic pollution in wetlands and remediation action. So I cannot move my slides, please, because Tony. Okay, now I think is okay. This is the overview of my presentation that you can see here. It's about some definitions about the wetlands, and then pesticides and different type of pollutions, and the project that I did in the Caspian Sea area some years ago, and some additional informations about the pesticide, since I am a pesticide toxicologist, basically. I try to go ahead, but it doesn't. Okay, now. Wetlands, as you can see, they are very important and valuable ecosystems with very important functions on the planet. They do lots of water-related actions on the planet, like, you know, prevent erosion, provide flood storage, and also they are very good places for the recreational activities. But the most important function of wetlands is the biodiversity, holding and supporting a big amount of biodiversity on the planet, including game species that are of great ecological and economic value. Because of the pollution that come from different sources to wetlands, now after some years, there are big toxic threats to this fauna of the wetlands. And among these pollutions, pesticides and biocides are key contaminants. But also there are also other contaminants like lead, that is a very, very known pollutant for human as well as for wildlife. Different type of metal pollutions like copper and that. Arsenicals, mercury, very important pollution in the wetlands. pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals, after many years of use, and because they go finally to the water systems, and then they are making big problem as a pollutants. And recently, in recent years, plastics and microplastics. I can say that microplastics is a toxicological problem. Also, toxic algae, cyanotoxins, that they are related to cyanobacteria, and also lots of pollution from the sediment in the wetlands. Next slide, please. In wetlands, there are, different type of pollution, and one of the points that I'm going to talk about it in this webinar is about the special situation that we have in rice paddies in Asian countries, that usually they are under big pesticide pressure. Also, about the persistent organic pollutants, POPs, that they were at first about 8 of them, and the starting one was DDT as a chlorinated insecticide, and some other insecticide like heptacolor, chlordone, and chlordecone, and they were 8. But later, persistent organic pollutants increased to about 30 compounds now. As the name you can see, they are persistent. When they are used, they stay in the environment and do not go easily. And so now even though the most usage of these compounds stopped, is some years that we are not using any more POPs, but still shouldn't move now. I'm sorry, these slides move just one by one, and it's not in my control, Tony.
Dr. Mahdavi, just let me know which slide you need to be on, and I will advance from now on. Just say next slide, please.
It shouldn't move now. It moved to the next slide, and I was talking in the slide before this. It's okay anyway. So that's the problem. Yeah, this is the, so when I want to go ahead, I ask you, Tony. Thank you very much. So we have still persistent organic pollutants around in many places of the world. They have different, abilities to move, like what it is called the grasshopper effect, that they can move from one places to other places. For example, we use lots of these materials in the different places of the earth, and not in the in the North Pole, but they are found in the North Pole, in the body of polar bears, for example. So we have lots of problem now still with the POPs, and also their metabolites, because after some chemical pollutants is not only themselves, they break to metabolites, and sometimes we have more problem with the metabolites, and that's what we cannot, why we cannot follow the route of pollution clearly. The other toxic pesticides that, generally talking, as it was mentioned at the first of webinar, I call pesticides as all of them: insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. We call them pesticides. But in some countries, they call pesticide only as pest killer, and they put herbicide and other things separately. Anyway, one of the big group of insecticides that used in recent years, neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoids, they are very, very potent killers of birds, as well as for bees, honeybees. They are really affected, and there are lots of, documented papers about this pollution now. Because of these pollutions that I mentioned now, birds cannot reproduce easily. For example, what we found about the persistent organic pollutants, they stop the deposition of the calcium in the eggshell, and eggshell thickness, it gets less and less, and then so there is no real egg, and then there will be no more reproduction and no more birth. Next slide, please. Okay. As I mentioned, one of the big pollutants generally, as well as in wetlands, is lead. Lead in wetlands is most because of the bullet leads, or lead bullets that because of hunting, unfortunately, there are, I can say, really hundreds of millions hunting guns with billions of lead bullets that they are targeting the wildlife, and most of these are for bears in wetlands. In one wetlands in our country, in Iran, it was a very, very high amount of this lead pollution, about 80 tons only in one season because of the hunting guns. But fortunately, this year they managed to do some regulation about this, and the pollution is now stopping. There are also some solutions for this that using alternatives for lead ammunitions. In fact, I do not believe on the hunting, and I don't know what is about. But anyway, it seems that some people want to do it, and so the option is alternative for lead ammunitions. And the other thing, awareness about lead poisoning for wildlife. There are lots of this kind of awareness about WHO and different other UN agencies, and also about the lead paint and etc. Next slide, please. I had a talk about the biocides some years ago in Singapore. Biocides are a type of compounds, we call them emerging pollutants, emerging water pollutants. These materials are really important as a pollutant because we use them every day. They are, started from soap, detergents, antibacterial, different type of alcohols, aldehydes, and heavy metals, phenols, and many type of compounds that they have very wide uses in hospitals, in oil industry, and because of that, and because they are most of the time their use is accompanied with some water, so they are very important as pollutants also for wetlands. Next slide, please. I can say that perhaps the most important pollutant in wetlands, as well as in the rice paddy fields, is mercury. That's because mercury in the wetlands and also in agricultural rice paddies change to the methylmercury. And methylmercury have the ability to bioaccumulate in the body of living organisms in wetlands, in fish, in aquatic insects, in frogs, snakes, birds, etc. The process we studied truly the process of bioaccumulation and bioconcentration and biomagnification some years ago. These are very important processes that happen, and I believe that now, because of the microplastics, the situation is getting very complicated, and we have to do more work about this and about synergistic effects that may happen. They are really, the aquatic system is in big danger because of these pollutants. And we have to expect that in larger animals, then the bioaccumulation is higher. For example, in predatory fish. Bioaccumulation, as we studied in the past, happens most in the fat body of the, for example, insects or other animals. And to reduce this, we have to reduce the methylmercury production in rice paddies. Next slide, please. This picture that I forgot to mention the origin of the pictures are about the global pattern of mercury in rice grain and also global pattern of methylmercury in rice grains. As you can see in the very darker places here, there are more and more of these pollutants, and as we go to the lighter is less. It seems that in the rice production countries, this is higher, this pollutant. Next slide, please. These are some pictures about the mercury in wetlands. There is a general picture here about the places that we have more mercury pollution. This picture is about exactly persistent organic pollutants in wetlands, and some other pictures about the other mercury pollution in wetlands. Next slide, please. Some years ago, I had a talk in the University of Kyoto as toxic threat in Asian wetlands. In Asia, because we have a rice crop and the place is called paddy fields, because the water stays in the field, and so it's called paddy fields, and it's usually very, very, you know, just even, and because of that they call it paddy fields. In these countries in Asia, many wetlands are directly or indirectly connected to wetlands, and because usually they use lots of pesticides in rice paddies, this is a big problem, as well as also fertilizers, and go to the rice paddies and make lots of pollution and bring down the biodiversity. That later I'll talk about it in the case study that I did in Mazandaran. Next slide, please. This is the situation of paddy rice in Asian countries, that usually rice is transplanted in water. Usually there are some other types of planting, but still most of the rice fields are in this way that you can see. And as I mentioned, it is the place of high use of pesticides and fertilizers, and finally going to the wetlands. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, they go finally the pesticide that use they go to the wetlands. And in recent years, the usage of pesticides have been increasing because of some corporate pressure that usually they want to sell more pesticide, and that is what is happening. In fact, when we calculate that really how much pesticide we really needed in whole earth, we can see that they are, using more than usual. And I have some figures that to mention it, but I can say really sometimes that is twice the amount that is used. Usually a pesticide in the companies that the industry that make pesticide is designed to kill. And unfortunately, most of the pesticides, generally talking, and I'm talking more about insecticide because I'm an insecticide toxicologist basically, they are targeting the nervous system. And because of this common target, that's why when pesticide is used on insecticide are used on insects, but they don't recognize between insects and other vertebrates and invertebrates, and go directly to the nervous system of non-targets and have their effects. And the other study that I did in the past, we found that regulations stops at the border. That I'll talk about this later in the slides. It means that the producing countries usually have good regulations, but when the pesticides are imported or exported from those companies to other countries, the regulation doesn't go there and stops at the border. Next slide, please. This is a message that I hope that you can go and see it on the internet by Google search. How pesticides are handled in developing countries. This means that in developing countries, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we do not have so much regulation. And I studied 2-3 decades, and we found that the big problem is no enforcement. We have some regulations in developing countries, but there is not so much enforcement. So that's a big problem that I mentioned. Please go and see that message. When there is no regulation, we have to stop the use of pesticides. Also in the UNIA 2, I mentioned this in the resolution of the GMG SF of the UNIA 2 in Nairobi, as well as also in the Kyoto talk, and also in a recent talk in Toledo, Spain, for the CMS, for the UNEP CMS preventing poisoning. I mentioned about all of this. I also had a talk for the Society of Wetland Scientists again last year in China, that most of these are mentioned. I mentioned that in the beautiful city of Changchun, that I forgot to put it on a slide. Next slide, please. This is the case study that I did in Mazandaran by the Caspian Sea, where the Ramsar is, and the beautiful and big name of Ramsar comes from there. Most rice paddies in Iran are in Mazandaran, and also in a neighboring province called Gilan. And in both of these provinces, they are under pressure of pesticides, as it is everywhere in the world. About here, you can see the diazinon insecticide. I started a study on diazinon 40 years ago as my master thesis, gas chromatographic analysis. Unfortunately, the diazinon, always they say that it is stopped and it is regulated, but still it is in use. And it is a really very total killer insecticide. And we tried and we mentioned a lot to stop this, at least in Iran, but it seems that it doesn't want to go from the fields of Iran. Next slide, please. Excuse me. This is the beautiful city of Ramsar, where I was close to the place that I was living and teaching in the University of Mazandaran. This is about 150 kilometers from the place that I was in Babolsar and Feridun Kenar and Sari. The place of rice paddies. Next slide, please. This is a map of the Feridun Kenar wetland and a map of the Caspian Sea. This photo belongs to the 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And if you do a real photo now, you can see these oil wells all around it. And they are making lots of pollution to this lake that is the biggest lake on the planet. And lots of pollution. Next slide, please. Mazandaran and Gilan, two neighboring provinces of Iran by the Caspian Sea, are the place of rice paddies, and we have lots of use. And because of this, when I was there in Mazandaran, about 20 years there teaching, I was very careful about using these pesticides to trying to regulate, to stop them, with not so much success, unfortunately. And still I'm trying. I had a talk in the College of Agriculture in the University of Agriculture in Sari some months ago, and it was about this the situation of pesticide. And I observed that now many newspapers, local newspapers, and also national newspapers printed some part of that. And you can see that in my Instagram page. I just put a link about that. Next slide, please. The project that I did, it was measuring the acute toxicity of pesticide on wetlands and on Caspian Sea gammarids, fish, and beneficial insects in orchards. I did this with a Prostat computerized LC50 analysis program that we developed it, and we wrote it and developed it in the University of Gulf during my PhD. Very good program. It was a masterpiece that time. Even they used it in US because we were able to calculate acute toxicity very correctly. And I did that, and I brought it to Iran, and I gave it for free to my students that they worked on this project that you can see measuring the acute toxicity of some insecticide and one herbicide, butacolor, on the fish and gammarids or amphipoda of the Caspian Sea. The exact species was Pontogammarus difargoides moeticus. Some of my students that did their thesis on this, and we worked some years on this project. Next slide, please. Feridun Kenar wetland that I lived beside that more than 10 years there was a place of, some poisoning and killing of bears, migratory bears that they were coming from the flyways and then doing overwintering there. And it was a very, very tough situation for them. But after some activities that we did and some advocacy and activity, now the situation is changing and it's getting better, and now the bears are coming back again. This is the my event in the Wetlands, World Wetlands Day 2017, some years ago. Next slide, please. This is the video that I think it was supposed to be played. Okay, this is a Ferredukenar wetlands. It's a very, very short video that I did this. Hopefully that it works and it plays. Okay, this is just some months ago that I was there, and I do visit this wetland and some other wetlands in Mazandaran regularly. Nearly every month I go there. This is a short video that I took it some few months ago. It was just some kind of about winter time there. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, in Toledo, Spain, I did a presentation for the UNEP CMS preventing poisoning there about 2 years ago in February 2017. And I showed that how much insecticides, acaricides, and nematicides, these three groups of pesticides are related more to each other as a formula. And they are very, very potent killers of many, many life in the wetlands, really, and non-target. They use, for example, the second generation anticoagulant rodenticide. That's a group of rodenticides. They are used widely now, also in some countries, but in most developed countries, the usage is stopped. It's still okay. It came back. Yeah, this was a talk, and this I also helped for the program of work for the later for the CMS preventing poisoning. That next slide, please. Here, in the 2 years ago, then some months after my talk in the Convention of Migratory Species in Manila, my work mentioned in the report of this convention that the link is here. You can see it, and you can go and see those activities that I mentioned there. Next slide, please. What I've been doing during all these years is helping people, environment, and wildlife against toxic pollution. And under the NGO Sustainable Agriculture and Environment that I founded in more than 15 years ago in Iran, and later also some activities in Canada. Next slide, please. This is the work that I've been doing generally. When I say here 15 years is more, I can say 25, 30 years I've been doing this work, just with nothing for business, nothing for income, just for health. And I try to be more concentrated on the MENA region. MENA is Middle East and North Africa. I did work with many of these, agencies and NGOs that you can see. His Department of Pesticide Regulation when I was in Berkeley, REACH with ECHO that I was in Helsinki many times, and FAO, WHO, EPA that really it was a first starting and lots of learning from EPA, OECD, PMRA in Canada, and etc. Many agencies during these years I was trying to help really for people and environment. Next slide. We say insecticides, wildlife poisoning by insecticides. One of the worst one that in the past now stopped is carbofuran. I put the insects here green because I mentioned this in many of my talks. We had about, for example, 10,000 species of insects 300 million ago in Precambrian era. These species increased to about 3 million now. 3 millions of insect species, already 1.2 only known, 1.2 million of these known and named. But from this, only less than 10,000 species are pests. And with the unregulated use of insecticides, we managed, the human being managed to kill lots of population of these insects that are the main food for bears and many other living system and living organism on the planet. And we are observing in recent years big collapse of insect populations in many different orders, that we have more than 30 orders of insects. And this is very, very dangerous situation. That's because of the unregulated use of insecticides. This is about my observation in Guelph, that some bears were dropping because of the entering the sequestrated insecticide to their body. Carbamaz, for example, aldicar, very, very, very dangerous insecticide with only 2 milligram per kilogram LD50s. Diazinon that I worked for many years, neonicotinoids and OPs that are organophosphorus insecticide. This is sign for organophosphorus insecticide that we use. Fipronil is again, and also some big effects on earthworm, and DDT and POPs that still they are around. And I had a talk in Nairobi for the UN some years ago under the Stockholm Convention. DDT is still in use because of malaria, and we cannot put it away completely. And however, my talk was about some alternative for DDT, but it's still is in use against malaria. Next slide, please. This is another message that you can find it on the internet with Google search, more exposure in developing countries. Because of lack of regulation and enforcement, we have more exposure of people and environment to pesticides and other chemicals as compared to developed countries. Because in developed countries, we have good regulation and enforcement, even though they use more pesticides and chemicals. But we have lots of killings of people and wildlife in developing countries because of lack of regulation and enforcement. Next slide, please. We have more exposure in Asian countries due to different reasons that you can see here. We have dust. As I mentioned some years ago, for the first time, we have toxic dust, some toxic particles in the dust. And also no regulation really, and enforcement is very weak in whole developing countries. Lots of geogenic problems in these countries. This is the Persian Gulf during the dust, and this is the place of the beautiful Zayanderud in Isfahan, that some years it was dried, but we tried in our country to bring water back. Hopefully that water is on there now. Next slide, please. About the remediation of this toxic pollution situation in wetlands, the best way that is tried in soils and water and everywhere is really phytoremediation in constructed wetlands, as phyto extraction, phyto accumulation, and phyto sequestrations that usually in phytoremediation, we use plants or algae to remove contaminants from soil or water. And the process is mentioned here that you can see. And next slide, please. This is here you can see the different constructed wetlands with different situations. Some type of there are different type of plants that are used in constructed wetlands for remediation. Some are out of the water, immersed, and some submerged, and so there are different systems for this remediation in constructed wetlands. Next slide, please. This is about a place, beautiful place in Masule Gilan. And next slide, please. Next. Next. And thank you very much. If there is a question, please let me know.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahdavi. And I will be reading questions from our question pane. And if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to enter them now in the questions pane if you have not already. And if you have any afterwards, there's you can see that Dr. Mahdavi has provided email contact information, and you can send those directly to him. I'd like to actually begin, Dr. Mahdavi. I wished I hadn't seen slide 30 because we used to use carbamates for on fruit trees, and carbaryl in specifically we call it 7-dust. But there's also mention of neonicotinoids, excuse me, and that in the United States now has been implicated in as one of the factors in the collapse of bee colonies. Is this I guess an issue in Iran? I'm not sure if you all even use the same domestic bees that we do for honey production.
We have here the common, if you're talking about the honeybees only, we have the common species of honeybees that is a Apis mellifera. And as you mentioned, yes, we have big effect and big impact, negative impact of carbaryl, the 7 or other formulas that is still unfortunately may be used. There are, this kind of compounds are stopped. I did myself lots of activities really to stop this kind of compounds like carbaryl, but still maybe sometimes we have a very, very big country as a different 14 different neighbors, and so sometimes with smuggling and these things maybe this kind of compounds enters. But I tried to make the Ministry of Agriculture and the Plant Protection Organization really to stop this, and they are doing that. They are following. If you mean that, is that what you mean, Tony?
This is Lewis, and in part, yes.
Oh.
Yes, definitely. And I was also kind of curious, regarding the methyl mercury in rice paddies and any potential effects upon the people that actually work in the paddies, or is there more of a, I guess, a threat to?
Yeah. Louis,
Yes.
Louis, mercury is so important, is so potent pollutant that the UN already, started a different convention for that called Minamata. And I was also in the past Minamata, and the third Minamata will be coming soon in coming months. It's so, as you know, it is started in Japan some decades ago, and Minamata was the disease that because of the mercury pollution came. And so it is, lots of pollution. Even we have many of my students now measure. These years I don't go to the lab to measuring. I do some advocacy and taking the results and then working on them. They measured lots of this kind of pollution in hair, in other places, in aquatic, fish and other things. Yeah. But in people that work in rice paddies, I'm sure that I have seen some works, but I cannot remember exactly now. We have in Iran, Louis, in Iran is good that we have a good and very high number of academic papers, very high rank in the world. But unfortunately, not all of them come to the field at factory. And there are, good works, good scientific works, but so I try always to use these papers, as a basis of my information, then to help the people, environment, and wildlife.
Thank you. Okay. Let me make sure I don't have any more questions here. I was kind of curious about the Peristat computerized LC50 analysis and your work on the toxicity of pesticides in Caspian Sea.
Yeah.
Was that actually, I mean, I've never heard of a computerized LC50 analysis. I'm only familiar with like clinical trials, I guess, for lack of better words. I mean, did you actually have, how did you conduct the research on say the?
I tell you clearly that because that was a long, some years work. We did write that for as a LC50 measuring acute toxicity, but also we used it as a LD50 on insects in Canada. But in this project in Iran, we used it exactly as a LC50 for fish and gamarus in the water, in the small, containers in the lab. And always something that we called it replicated bioassays. Replicated bioassays that with the geometric regression, the dosage, serial dilution of the dosages, and then finally recording, and then it was usually 18 hours starting the recording until 4 days, 96 hours. And then the main result for us was the 96-hour LD50 or LC50. That is what we followed.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a very, very strong program that I gave it here to many of my students, and they are using, I think, it now, even now, many people. It was, I can say, 20 years ago that we did that work.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I look forward to learning more about that. Um, I had I also had I guess a question preying on my mind regarding uh, biocides and
Yeah,
the in I guess in polluting wetlands. I've but I have a couple of other questions, and let me get to those. Um, you talked about mercury in Asian wetlands. Is there an issue with arsenic, and have you used ferns to remediate arsenic contamination?
I'm sure that arsenic is also big pollutant here. But you mean in rice paddies? Do you mean in rice paddies?
I think just as generally as a remediation technique, not specific to
Yes,
wetland or rice paddy.
yes, yes. As I recall, there are many scientific work about the remediation method, for example, using nanotechnology for that. But as I know, arsenicals are one of four main pollutants in rice that they measure: arsenicals, cadmium, selenium, and mercury. These four type of pollutants are measured also in many papers now in Iran as comparison between the rice that are produced here in Mazandaran and Gilan and compared with the imported rice from India and other countries. And as I know, there are less pollution in all Iranian rice. Our Iranian rice is one of the most clean rice that I believe on that really finally. If you compare those results with each other, we have less pollution in the different local varieties of rice in Iran. Very, very, very high quality rice from Mazandaran and Gilan that I mentioned this also in my talk some months ago there. And it's more expensive, in fact, much, much more expensive and much more high quality as compared to the imported rice.
And the question was really specific to say constructed using ferns in constructed
Yeah,
wetlands for removal of arsenic, and was we're just curious to know if you had done
that,
anything
that
that specific.
that's a good idea. I'm sure I heard about that, but I cannot recall exactly work about that. But Luis, I know that there are lots of work on arsenics
Okay.
now. Yeah, yeah, I'm sure that some of them also are related to the rice and rice paddies, but I cannot recall any particular one right now.
Okay. And final question: are there any success stories for agricultural farms reducing their impacts from their chemical applications based on the organizations you mentioned? Um,
Uh, I
and
couldn't understand, Luis. You mean the alternative for pesticide for rice? Do you mean that?
um, not not specifically to rice, but
Yeah. You mean
in
generally alternative for pesticide? Yeah.
well, for example, you had mentioned uh, the or specific non-governmental organizations uh, in your lecture, and was wondering the question was have any of those, I guess, those organizations, or do you have any examples of farms, agriculture operations that have used guidelines from the NGOs for successfully remediating pesticide contamination on their farms. And any examples, say like in real life success story of a farm cleaning up their.
Yes, as I know, if you mean the guidelines is something about the FAO code of conduct, FAO code of conduct for pesticides. That's what the governments are and government agencies are trying to follow that. But as some work as an alternative, for example, in Iran, as I know, in north of Iran now they are using ducks, a field mix of rice, duck, and fish, and that's a good success also. I observed myself.
Okay.
That a mixed form of rice, duck, and fish, and that works very well. But as a anyway, I can't understand what you mean exactly about the pesticide in rice paddies.
Well, what I'll do is I'll make certain that the individual that asked the question knows that they may contact you for further clarification. And,
Okay.
I really appreciate you fielding our questions, and this has been a wonderful webinar. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahdavi, and I'm going to advance the slide now. And
thank you, Louis, and thank you for the Society of Wetland Scientists to giving me this opportunity to conduct this webinar, and I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Pleasure has been ours, definitely. I would like to announce that our next webinar is going to be on November 21st. Actually, I think I had 22nd, but on the schedule, but we'll make sure of this. And it will be Coastal Wetlands and Climate Change, by Dr. Ariana Sutton-Greer and Dr. Michael Osland. And I'll advance the slide one more time. We also would like to put out here the various social media links that you may visit in order to I guess use some of the resources of Society of Wetland Scientists. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance, and definitely once again Dr. Mahdavi, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.